Hello and welcome back to the Sports Gazette YouTube channel. Here we have Tris Dixon and we're here to talk about Damage. So Tris, what was the kind of inspiration behind the book Damage?
So I had always wanted to write a book about life after boxing because so many fighters struggle in retirement. And I kind of had thought it was down to, a boxer losing his identity, losing the routine and structure of his life and, how his the structure of his daily routine. And also the buzz of fight night. I kind of had always put it down to those three things, then fighters trying to find that buzz again. But it was only when I was reading The League of Denial about the concussion crisis in American football where I started to read about CTE. And it was actually known as punch-drunk syndrome back in 1928. And it was actually discovered in boxers. And there was a case of about 22 fighters who were taken to by a promoter to a doctor to study. And he studied their symptoms, and punch-drunk syndrome became part of the medical lexicon. That later became dementia pugilistica, and then it became CTE. So we're, in this modern lexicon, where we talk about CTE, it's actually punch-drunk syndrome. But no one in boxing has been talking about it all this time. And I've been in boxing for a couple of decades, and no one had mentioned CTE to me. And I was thinking, how am I the editor of Boxing News and I don't know what this is? People seem to think that punch-drunk syndrome or being punch-drunk was a lottery. Like some guys were affected by it, some guys weren't. We now obviously know through science that, multiple, as in hundreds, if not thousands of blows to the head have an effect, not just on how you are today, but how you are in the future as well.
I think for me, one of the things that struck me most was there's kind of a denial from boxers, especially kind of 70s and past that. I think one of the things that I took from the book was the Muhammad Ali thing and his family kind of defending his legacy. They're saying he would have got Parkinson's from being a bricklayer rather than just a boxer. Has this denial changed, since kind of the mid-70s onwards, and as well since you've written the book?
Not really, but I think the book is making a difference gradually. Well, I say gradually, in some areas it's making more strides than others. In terms of, it's still a bit of a taboo subject, certainly for fighters, and there's still not loads of education out there. The governing bodies, whether it's the British Boxing Board of Control, the Nevada State Athletic Commission or New York, they're not doing enough to teach boxers about what the long-term risks are. Everyone knows that on a bad night in a ring, you could be taken out, stretchered out, and worst case scenario, you could die. People do know that there are short-term risks. People don't know that if you have a long career boxing, that you might then develop Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, any of these long-term cognitive issues, and they're all linked to multiple blows to the head over a long period of time. So that amount of education needs to be increased, because when you talk about denial, I'm not sure it's denial as much as it's just not the knowledge out there.
When we talk about CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, quite the mouthful, it's obviously something that is in boxing, in rugby, lots of other sports as well at the moment. When you were finding out about it, what was it that you think is the most important thing that you learned about it, and what were you most surprised when you were into research?
So the thing that surprised me most really is how, I suppose, going back to the earlier questions, how it's not that there's a denial, but people refuse to see the symptoms in boxers as they get older, and they do think it is dementia or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's without realizing that these are all overlapping issues. ALS is another illness that fighters struggle with down the line. So I think that was probably one of the main things. And then I think, when I went to the brain bank in Boston and I was actually confronted with a brain that I could feel myself and then go and look at the slides and see CTE on it, I think that made me realize, because there's still deniers out there, not just the boxing does it, but there's still CTE deniers out there, like people that don't think it exists. But then to see the tau protein, what it's called, under the slides, and you think it's just undeniable. Like it's such a big thing, and it's such a big thing. Like it crosses so much stuff into domestic violence, car crashes, rugby, football, American football, boxing, MMA, all of, so many things that are in popular culture and culture, full stop. When you look at PTSD and all the rest of it, like there's so much stuff out there where it affects people, and yet there are still corners of not just the world, but the medical world where people deny its existence.
And so you mentioned the tau protein, which is one of the things that affects CTE or affects the brain. And I guess one of the challenges of writing this book is you're trying to convey this quite complicated disease across to sort of the lay person, if you wish. How do you go about that process?
Well, yeah, that was always going to be the worst part, right? And you've hit the nail on the head. How do you make a science book unsciency, and how do you make a sports book? And I suppose the best way I could do it was to use the case studies, of the guys that I knew and had experienced and seen their declines, and then to add a more humane element by introducing the families and the people who'd been afflicted and people who had to support the people who'd suffered with it. I suppose there was a balancing act between the science and the humanity, and it was a careful line that had to be trodden. And I think that was the biggest challenge, because you could just make it a science text. And that wasn't what it was about. It was about something that was going to be accessible so that it could make a difference. If it was just a thick science compendium of papers, no one in boxing would have read it. But to put it out the way that we did and to make it more accessible, that was the biggest challenge, and probably took the most amount of time, because you obviously going back to 1928, reading a lot of medical papers and trying to decipher them. And I was fortunate, a couple of neurologists who I met along the way were quite helpful in that respect, in sort of explaining stuff in plain English and helping point me in the right direction too.
Yeah, and were the scientists that you spoke to, were they quite receptive to what you were trying to do? Because obviously they wanted to get this message out there. I mean, it's been almost 100 years since the first, scientific paper was properly written on this. So
it's strange, isn't it? Because you wouldn't imagine there'd be neurologists in boxing, right? Because it's such a conflict of what people are. Imagine how they think. When they know exactly what's going on to a brain, and they're there ringside covering a fight, as a medical official. So yeah, they were conflicted, but they were massively helpful. And I think, they were shocked that nothing had been done sooner. And I think they, I don't know if they took it for granted that there wasn't, just accepting that there wasn't much knowledge out there about it in boxing at all levels. You could probably speak to a couple of the top promoters in boxing in the nicest possible way. They probably still couldn't spell CTE.
Tris, I just want to move on to Sparring. How much is Sparring in comparison to fighting affecting brain damage? Does the Sparring before a fight lead to brain damage? Is it the fight itself? Which one is it?
Yeah, so that's one of the ways that I've become more acceptant of staying involved in boxing and thinking that the fights are the fights. You've got to leave them as they are. That's the sport, right? But what can be changed is the sparring and the care before, after, and during a fight, before, after, and during a fighter's career. Okay, leave the fights. That is what they are. That is the sport. But the sparring, someone like a Mickey Ward who had 50-odd fights would say that 90% of his damage was done in sparring, and that's probably a common figure, right? Some of these guys are sparring 3 or 4 days a week in 10, 12-week camps for one night of fighting. So obviously, Tony Jeffries, a guy I spoke to, was an Olympic bronze medalist in 2008, had a 10-fight pro career before he had to retire with hand injuries. He worked out the amount of times he'd been hit in the head, and he'd had to retire, as I said, after 10 pro fights. He reckoned he'd been hit something like 30-odd thousand times. When he worked out, I've had X amount of rounds for this fight, times that by 50 amateur fights, then all this for 10 rounds, and this amount before I was 13, all the rest of it. Say I was getting hit 6 times a round, in this, and he worked out, many, many thousands of blows to the head in a short career. So I think, there's knowledge out there. Some of the guys like Tony and Cole Frampton has been super receptive for the book, but there's still there's a massive lack of knowledge out there, and you still see these viral videos on social media of guys beating the living daylights out of each other in sparring, and you're just thinking, well, they clearly don't know what the risks are, not just short term, but definitely long term.
Yeah, I think one person that's come out to he does spar is former UFC featherweight champion Max Holloway. Is there real examples in boxing where people have just decided, look, I'm just not going to spar, I'm just going to save my health for the fight specifically?
No, and I think when I've put that to fighters, they would be worried about them not being able to get the timing and the distance of their punches, and there is something to be said for being hit in the head and getting used to that feeling, because otherwise it's a bit jarring if you don't take any blows to the head and all of a sudden you get hit in the head. It's a bit of a shock to the system in more ways than one. But there are places, and the Ingle Gym in Sheffield's one place where they've had fighters like Nassim Hamed and Kell Brook and Johnny Nelson over the years, where their focus is body sparring. So they've taken out a lot of the contact to the head, and they've implemented a more stringent routine of body sparring, and then only bring in head sparring maybe 2 or 3 weeks away from a fight, just to try and get the guys accustomed to it. But in terms of no sparring, I've not heard that. I actually did hear it from Anthony Yard before a few fights, or Tundi, his trainer, but that was a fallacy, because I've actually been in the gym when he's been sparring, so I know that was just an old wives' tale.
Just wanted to move on to the MMA game. About just after the 2012 Olympics, I think they removed head guards from WS Super Series and Olympic Games. Why do you think the IOC did that?
I think it was probably more of a commercial thing, because you want to see the faces of the protagonists, you want to see the fighters, you want to try and see some sort of character in there, and personality and some sort of reaction, to try and make the guys more accessible, because with the head guards on, everyone kind of looks the same. So there's no real kind of identity there. So I think it was more of a commercial thing in terms of that. I don't think it was a safety measure.
Nothing to do with kind of concussion regulations or anything like that.
No, I don't think so. And there's been plenty of research done into head guards where they've looked at when someone sweats profusely and a head guard gets wet, it actually gets heavier. And so there's the risk of more torque being on a head guard if you're punched hard and you've got like a sodden head guard, of actually being more dangerous. And I remember when I was training with Kevin Rooney in the Catskills, they wouldn't let you wear a head guard because they thought it lulled you into a false sense of security, that if you got hit in the head, it was actually going to break some of the impact. It doesn't really do anything. It doesn't really change anything. The main thing about a head guard is it kind of protects the arches of the eyes, so that it stops you from picking up cuts and damage in that respect. But in terms of, if you're being banged in the face or in the head with a punch and you've got an inch thick leather case around it, it really doesn't make too much difference. Trust me, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's some sort of conversation happens in rugby, like the difference between skull protection and brain protection. Like wearing this scrum cap in rugby isn't going to protect you from concussion. I wonder, we're talking a lot about sparring here and how that a lot of the damage actually comes during training, not during the big concussive impacts that you see on TV, and sort of are the catalyst for this kind of change. But how do you sort of approach trying to change that narrative, that actually the big visual things that are happening are not the main issue, it's the things that are sort of...
I think you've got to get in the gyms. You've got to speak to the trainers. When I took my career break and tried to come out of boxing, I actually took my professional boxing trainer's license with the British Boxing Board of Control, and I was licensed by them to train because I thought that was going to be part of my gym. And I did the training course, and there was nothing about damage, CTE or sparring for trainers on that. And it was I had my eyes wide open going into that, knowing, almost half looking out for it, waiting for the very mention of the word concussion. I don't even think it came up more than twice over a weekend course. So I think the way is to get the regulatory bodies to feed into the gyms and to the trainers. I think that's the only way, because unless you had a poster boy like an Anthony Joshua or Tyson Fury putting the message out there, but I can't see those guys putting their head above the parapet and saying, oh, what we're doing actually is quite dangerous, maybe your kids shouldn't be doing it and stuff, because that is another conversation. In certain countries, obviously, you can't head a football now at 14 or younger, but over here you can fight from the age of 11.
Mm-hmm. And, all this evidence is here. You've written the book, the scientific papers are there now, but boxing seems to continue to be so to run away from the problem more than it does run towards it. Why do you think that does it stem from fear? Is it still denial?
Yeah, so for me, that's probably the most frustrating thing, because, we've got all this knowledge now. We can actually get in front of this problem. You can actually start putting measures in place. And you do see, with football, rugby, the NFL, you do see them sort of taking precautionary measures. Football, around the time of the World Cup, there was talk about no heading the football the day before or the day after a game. And, boxing's doing absolutely nothing. And that's the most frustrating thing, because if boxing is shut down in any way, shape or form, and we are facing losing it from the 2028 Olympics through to poor regulation, if boxing is shut down, it will be annoying, because I'm out here shouting from the rooftop saying, fix this problem, because we could get shut down. And if they don't fix it, we could lose the sport. And the thing is, we're not losing a blood sport. It doesn't have to be that way. We're losing a sport that's a very sort of clever and scientific sport, but is seen as another way. But we're perpetuating that sort of barbaric nature by not looking after the guys, and guys and girls. And there's a lot more that can be done to help these guys. And, that's the sad thing about the road to nowhere, is when I was going around and meeting all these old fighters, a lot of them were on hard times and were struggling and, were slurring their speech and were, did suffer with massive short-term memory loss and, did have shakes from Parkinson's and all the rest of it. And they were all, one guy, Harold Johnson, I had to keep turning off the dictaphone, former light heavyweight champ. I had to keep turning off the dictaphone to save my cassette space, because he kept repeating the same story time and time again, within 30 seconds or a minute of each other. So, I didn't know then what I know now, but now obviously I can put it down to CTE and kind of explain what it was. But I just find it frustrating, because there's so much that we can do to help the people and nothing's being done.
So I got one more, George, before I let you go back on. It sort of ultimately for me comes down to this balance between sort of the autonomy of the sportsman, who feels as if they are, they're consenting to being part of this sport, but on the other hand, you've got these governing bodies who it's their responsibility to look after the athlete. Maybe in the past you could say, well, it wasn't informed consent, so these, they have a realistic, or the athletes don't really understand what they're getting into, but now that they do, how do you think you've balanced that? Like we're talking about trying to change boxing to what it is now.
Yeah, I think that, that's one of the most interesting things that I found with the book and the research and speaking to fighters is, the amount of time fighters have said to me, oh, we know the risks. And they don't. They literally do not know the risks. They don't know about possibly getting Alzheimer's in their 40s or 50s. They don't know about, not knowing who their kids are 20 years from now. They don't know about all this sort of stuff that could well happen to them. And it's not like a lottery like they think it is, like, oh, maybe I'll be okay, maybe I won't. Like, if you stick around long enough to be damaged, like, it might not be there when you retire. And that's another thing I hear, oh, I want to get out with my faculties, or he's got out with his faculties. Well, that might be the case in your mid-30s, but by the time, you're 50, you might be in a rest home. We've seen it happen, like, countless times. So, I don't know, it's a frustrating thing, because some of the fighters I know and some of the top trainers I know haven't read Damage because they're worried about how it will change their thoughts and stuff. But then, we had a very controversial stoppage in boxing on Saturday night in a fight between a Mexican, Mauricio Lara, and Lee Wood. And all of a sudden, Damage is being quoted like the Bible because, a guy was really badly hurt and the trainer stepped in and stopped him for taking more punishment. And now it's part of the conversation where people are saying, oh, well, have you read Tris's book? Because actually, whether or not he's gone to hospital on Saturday night, he's maybe been saved from a rest home in 15 years from now.
Yeah, that was my next question about the weekend action. See, there was a lot of controversy around it. A few people saying, oh, we should have waited because there was only 10 seconds left. Should that matter? But there's only 10 seconds.
You see, the fighter in me and the sportsman in me and the sports journalist in me says, well, I've seen people survive worse cases of being concussed than that. So, yeah, give him the chance and let him be the hero and ride out. But then, obviously, you've got the thing where the guy comes up, he's been down hard, for anyone who hasn't seen it. He's been down on the floor really hard. He's got up He's really woozy, on unsteady legs. It's 10 seconds to go. His corner don't know there's 10 seconds to go. He's asked to put his hands up, and he's sort of really woozy and just about puts his hands up. And the corner throws in the towel and says no more. Great. I think that's a good stoppage, okay? Imagine if the corner hadn't thrown the towel out. The referee, by the way, who I thought was terrible, has allowed it to go on. Imagine if he goes out, he's not strong enough to hold his hands up properly, and he gets absolutely blown to bits. Then obviously it's the worst thing ever that he's allowed it to continue. So hindsight's a powerful thing, isn't it? But I'm of the old philosophy, definitely stop it too soon than too late, right? And I think there's a lot to be said for that. And from a sales point, now there's the rematch is viable. Was it stopped too soon? Can you make a case for it? But obviously more than that, Lee Wood's got his health, and he didn't have to take any more unnecessary shots, because I've seen fighters in worse states than that allowed to continue and being absolutely pulverized, and it's not a pretty sight.
Well, for his hell. I'd like to talk about matchmaking. Obviously, that was a really even matchup of the fight, but a lot of times in boxing, you get like a pro turning over, and you leave it against like a German as such who's had 100 fights, but he kind of just goes to win. Would you think about those kind of matchup? Do you think that's right?
It's interesting. I mean, that's the traditional way to build a prospect, okay? And the idea, these guys have had 100 fights. They've not been knocked out 100 times. They've gone the distance and given these guys a few rounds, and, so that the guy turning over gets the experience of going a few rounds, boxing in front of a different crowd, boxing, with no vest, no head guard, and all the rest of it, making the changes needed, with smaller gloves for the professionals. Obviously, professionals use smaller gloves. So it allows them to sort of get some reps under their belt. The only thing is, for me, is like as a sport, the interesting things in sport are where there's contests, where there's jeopardy, and you don't know who's going to win. And the problem is, if you're trying to sell a fight of an Olympian who's had 100 amateur fights and is expected to win every round of a 4-rounder against a guy who's had a couple of 100 losses, there's no jeopardy. Obviously, that's why we tuned into Liverpool, Real Madrid last night. Is we don't know who's going to win. There's jeopardy, right? That's what makes a good fight, is you don't know who's going to win. When you match a hot prospect with a guy that's just showing up, with all due respect for the paycheck, there's no jeopardy, and you're thinking, well, what's the point?
That's all of my quick questions.
Do we have any questions from the floor before going? Okay, then.
My question is around, we've seen slap fighting is rising, and to win a match, by definition, you need to get knocked out. And scientifically, we've seen Rostad that talk that a knockout is essentially a concussion. And boxing is obviously having a lot of pressure on whether they'll be in the Olympics and need to clean their house in order. But we've seen that side of sport growing and rise. How do we strike a balance? Because we know the athletes don't know. Does somebody need to say some of these things don't need to happen?
Yeah, I mean, slap fighting doesn't need to happen, right? Yeah, I mean, it's like Russian roulette, isn't it? At what point do you stop with that kind of stuff? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the guys did touch upon it. There is a fine line between informed consent and authorities actually need to take some responsibility and say, well, that's just stupid. We're not going to do that. And obviously, the Nevada State Athletic Commission, where they've allowed slap fighting, it's crazy, isn't it? Because these guys are set up, these regulatory bodies are set up to protect athletes, and they're letting these guys get smashed around the face unprotected. I fail to see how that protects anyone.
It's interesting hearing this bit.
Earlier, Steve, also just mentioning about new card and anti-doping, and I suppose pivoting slightly, how bad is the use of performance-enhancing drugs in boxing? Is it something that you've witnessed?
No, so this is where I'm at with it. Like, I don't really know. I go through these spells of thinking everyone's on it, and then no one's on it, and it's a really strange thing. So when Conor Ben had his positive tests, you saw people who knew him saying, Oh, he'd never do it. He'd never do it. I think, just loosely, maybe his dad said he'd never do it. His wife, one of his training partners, and his coach. That's 4 people saying he'd never do it. But I'm convinced, and I had this chat with Carl Frampton as well once, and I said, if he was taking stuff, I'm sure he would have been that ashamed of taking stuff. He probably wouldn't have told anyone, let alone all 4 people. And so this is the thing, I'm guessing people can buy all this stuff online, or, if bodybuilding gyms, where that stuff happens, I live in a place in the New Forest, and I remember a few years ago, someone in a village team relatively near to me passed away, and they'd found that he had performance enhancing drugs in his system. I'm like, that's A, right here, and B, a really low level stuff. What are you doing? So I don't know. I talked about it with Sam Sexton actually with a podcast that goes up today, and he was a British heavyweight champion, and he thought PEDs were quite prevalent, and he also thought there was a difference for each tier. He thought that had he taken PEDs, he would have gone from British to European level, and he thought anyone that was on a European level, if they were taking PEDs, it would have made them world level. That was the way that he looked at it. But I don't know. I mean, like I said, I go to the boxing gyms, and some of them are real spit and sawdust. And you're like, how would these guys know what to take? And also, when you look at so I'm reading this book on the dirtiest race in history, about Ben Johnson and Carl Lewis, the 1988 Seoul Olympic final, where I think everyone at some point or another got popped. And it's a relatively embryonic stage of PED testing. And for boxing, I go to the spit and sawdust gyms, and I don't know anything about PEDs or the names. I know the ones that pop up, like nandrolone and testosterone, the one, clomiphene now that everyone in boxing is an expert on through the Bain case. But I'm like, how would someone in a spit and sawdust gym who doesn't know how to squat properly, who thinks the best way of getting in shape for a fight is not eating and not drinking, and then piling on as much weight as you can afterwards, how would they know what to take? And obviously there's then the stuff that would then make you big and strong, but obviously in a weight-governed sport, then you've got to lose weight. So then do you take the stuff that loses the weight, the diuretics, and then at what point do you balance in the stuff for performance, where, the doctor that was associated with Conor Benn said this thing about performance as well, is where, sometimes the guys that look like they're taking stuff are the guys that are the clean guys, and then there's a fight between 2 heavyweights where they broke punch stats for the most punches thrown in a fight. They're 2 bigger, chunky guys, but they've obviously got incredible engines. And he sort of said that that was the sort of fight where you want to be testing the guys, because it's not based on looks, but these guys with phenomenal fitness engines. So how would you know what to take when they don't even know how to squat properly, half of these guys? I don't know. It's tough. I keep going around in circles, and I think that's why I want to write the book. I want to try and get to the bottom of where we are actually at with it. Sorry, I didn't really answer it, but I tried.
And Jackson would recommend.
Yeah, you mentioned the gyms that maybe
The boxers can go and find this stuff. Do you think making boxing safer in general has to start at the elite level of the professional, or does it more have to start in the amateur level and filter?
Probably both ways. You probably need those role models and examples at the top feeding down, but at the entry level, you need to be set on the right path as well, right? So you should be always obviously taught to do things the right way at the start, but you obviously need those role models feeding those philosophies down from the top. So it's probably a good blend, I would say.
Maybe just one more question to round it out, Tris. You've obviously gone very deep into sort of a systemic problem in boxing, let's say. What is your relationship like with the sport now? How has it changed, and what would you like to see? That's quite a big question to me.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I made peace with it when I came to the decision saying the fights are the fights, and there's not going to be, if everyone just did their fights without all the sparring on top, they'd probably be okay. So now I think that enough can be done to mitigate the risks to make the guys and girls okay moving forwards, as long as it was done. Going back to the stuff I talked about with Richard at the start, I still have moments where I really dislike the sport, when these big fights aren't getting made, when the PED things happen and, they backdate suspensions and no one actually misses the prime of their career, no one gets any real punishments, and, the backbiting between the promoters and all the rows that go on, and, the issues with networks and big fights not getting made and all the rest of it. There's elements of it that I just hate, but then when it gets it right, there's nothing else like it. So it's a tough one. And then obviously, with the podcast I have, I've done 210 Boxing Live stories now, and they're just some wonderful people in it. Wonderful guys and girls who wouldn't have had the lives that they've had without it. And I said at the end of Damage, I still believe that boxing has saved more lives than it's taken. Don't get me wrong, I think it's taken thousands, well beyond the ones that are just brain damage from fights and died from fights, but obviously the ones that have suffered neurologically down the line. But from my old amateur club, I would say that boxing saved my life in many ways, from a life that I could have gone down. I could say the same for at least a dozen guys that were boxing at the same time as me. So I think it still has an integral part to play in the sporting landscape. I would like to see it in schools without head contact, with all the discipline, self-respect, self-discipline, respect for others implemented, which boxing does help with massively, helps with self-confidence, self-esteem and stuff as well. So it definitely has a place, but we just need to get in front of the curve with what we know, and unfortunately we're well behind it.
I think that's a good way to end. There is hope at the end of the tunnel, hopefully. Tris, thank you so much for joining us for a full hour on the Sports Gazette. We're very lucky. Thank you very much to George. Thank you very much to the slightly older and slightly less attractive Richard Denton. And thank you very much to the audience, and we will catch you again next time on the Sports Gazette.
Okay.